All right, this is 101, week 8, part 2. So one thing to one thing to think about is, I know this is hard to imagine, but just you write your papers because I make you write your papers, and the only person that reads them is me. But in school, and I mentioned this on your 101 handout about how to write essays, we play this game. And the game is, you want to write this, you're pretending like you could hand this to someone on the street and they would be able to read your words. So, like, a lot of my students will just be like, um, prompt number 1 says, and then they put the quote that I put there for them to discuss. But see, somebody on the street doesn't have the handout that I gave you about where, because you're writing your response. I'm giving you an assignment that has like, pick 3 things. Here's 3 things to write about. Pick one of them. You go. Prompt number 2 says, sorry, I'm going to sneeze. Sorry. So a lot of my students will be like, prompt number 2 says, but the person who you imagine you would hand this essay to doesn't have prompt number 2. So that's why you got to say the name of the book, the name of the author, and why the author is important. Now, students feel stupid telling me, because they say, I tell my students, right, ancient Greek philosopher Plato writes in his book Phaedrus, blah, 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 blah. And students feel a little stupid doing that, I think, because I know what the Phaedrus is. They like I know Plato's an ancient Greek philosopher. I'm the one who gave you Plato. So that's why you're doing that. But again, this is this weird game we play in college where we imagine someone who's never read it before. They might not know who Plato is, or even if they know, they may need a reminder of some kind. So that's why you got to say the name of the author, the name of the book, and why the author matters not every single time, but in every single paper you write. Now, you don't have to do it every single time. So, for example, if you're writing a paper about Plato's Phaedrus, the first time you quote Plato's Phaedrus, you got to say the whole thing. Ancient Greek philosopher Plato writes in his book Phaedrus, blah, 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 blah. After that, you can just go, Plato says, and that's it. Or in the Phaedrus, because you already told me, if it's the first time you quote, you got to have all 3 of those pieces of information. After that, you can shorten it. You can't get rid of it altogether. You can't just start quoting without introducing your quotes. You got to say, the first time you're going to say ancient Greek philosopher Plato in his book, The Phaedrus, says blah, 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 blah. After that, you can just be like, Plato says, Plato says, Plato says, and I'll know it's from the same book, unless you change books, in which case you better introduce it. Plato says in his other book, The Republic, blah, 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 blah. The idea is that somebody who's not in this class, who's never read this before, would be able to follow what you're saying. It seems stupid because most students just think about school as the teacher makes you do stuff and you do it, you get a grade, you get enough grades, you get a degree. You pass the class, you pass enough classes, you get a degree. They don't think about the fact that what we're teaching you is supposed to teach you how to do something in the world. And in the world, you got to explain where you're getting this stuff from, because the world is not school. And so you want to write it in a way that other people could potentially follow. Okay, well, that's pretty easy. Now, all right, so that's what you got to have. So you got to have the name of the author, the name of the book, and why the author matters. And you can have like a verb. Plato says, Plato writes, Plato whatever. And actually, with your class, with 101, you may need to be like, in Plato's, ancient Greek philosopher Plato wrote a book called the Phaedrus. In the Phaedrus, Socrates says. In the Phaedrus, Phaedrus says. In the Phaedrus, Lysias is quoted as saying, right? So you got to add a little extra because there's characters in Plato's Phaedrus. But you get the idea. You got to explain where this is coming from. The next part of quoting, citation, is the actual material. And I think people know how to do this pretty easy. I don't think this needs a super complicated lesson here, but if you're using Plato's exact words, slap it in quotation marks. That's it. If you're putting it in your own words, like if you say in other words, you still have to say something. Like in other words, you still need to introduce it. You can't just drop Plato's words in. Boy, this is hard to teach. I hate teaching this. Let's say you don't want to quote. Let's say you don't want to use the exact words. You just want to paraphrase. So you could say, let's say you want to, instead of using Plato's exact words, let's say you just want to give somebody the idea of what's going on in the book. So you want to say like, the soul is like a chariot with 2 horses. That's your own words. That's how you would put it, right? The soul is like, a chariot and 2 horses are dragging the chariot around. Do you see how, even if you're not using Plato's exact words, the whole idea of the soul being like a chariot with horses, that's Plato's idea. It's not his words, but it's his idea. Well, then you got to go. Plato, ancient Greek philosopher, and Plato, in his book Phaedrus, compares the soul to a chariot with two horses, one good and one bad. See, so even if you don't use the exact words, you still got to introduce the thing. If you don't do that, if you just say, the soul is like a chariot with two horses, one good, one bad. If you just say that, see, I might read your paper and think, well, probably not me, but somebody might read your paper and think it's your idea. It's not. It's Plato's ideas. That's why even when you're paraphrasing or summarizing, you got to say, Plato says in his book Phaedrus, ancient Greek philosopher Plato says in his book Phaedrus, blah, 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 blah. Okay, cool. And that's it. And if it's a summary, then you're taking, something big and stripping it down to a couple of sentences. And if it's a paraphrase, you're taking a sentence that Plato wrote and putting it in your own words. And if it's an exact quotation, you're using the exact words on the page and you're putting them in quotation marks. It's pretty simple. My experience is most students have an easy time with that. Now, in my classes, I tend to recommend that you both quote and put things in your own words. I think that's the best way to do it. Quote Plato, then put Plato in your own words, and then give examples and blah, blah, blah. But you could technically skip past the quotes and go right to paraphrase. But my experience is students often get confused if you skip the quote part. But some of your other classes and other teachers might want you. My wife, for example, doesn't really want people quoting. She wants people always putting in their own words. I tend to like to see people quote first. It depends on the discipline, right? So English tends to want something a little different from a psychology class, because the exact words matter in an English department in a way that they don't in a psychology department. Psychology departments tend to be interested in the ideas, whereas your poetry professors and your literature professors and your English professors tend to be interested in the words, which is why I like to see quotes and put it in your own words. Other classes just want you to put it in your own words, and other classes just want you to summarize. So it depends what you're being asked to do. Usually teachers stop here and they go, that's it, that's how you quote. And they move on with their lives. But there is a very, very important third part to this, right? Because you had the introduction. Plato says, ancient Greek philosopher Plato says in his book Phaedrus, then you put blah, 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 put the quotes, blah, 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 put all the stuff in the quotation marks. And then a lot of teachers treat it like you're done now, like you're all finished, but you're not finished. There's another thing you got to do. And it's the most important thing of all. And teachers teach it like a separate thing, but it's not a separate thing. Every time you quote something, I want to hear what you think of the quote. I need your opinion. This is hugely important. I mentioned this. If you look at the 101 handout that shows you how to write papers for college, I mentioned that the papers are about your opinion. Which means, because the questions, if you look at the assignments, the questions tend to ask you, Plato says this, what do you think of that? So I'm asking you for your opinion. Which means every time you quote, you better put your opinion after it, because the only reason you're quoting is to tell me what you think of what you read. Now, in high school, a lot of times they just don't believe that you read. And so the reason you're quoting and summarizing is to prove that you did the reading. That's not what we're doing anymore. In college, what we want to know is, what do you think of what you read? What's your opinion on what you read? And so you gotta have your opinion after every quote. I need you to follow it up with sort of I agree or disagree, or I'm making a point and this quote connects to my point like this, right? You gotta have you. So it's not just about quoting and putting things in your own words. The paper is yours. Your name is the top of the paper. And the paper in English department papers are about your opinion. I'm not asking you to write a book report where you just tell me what Plato said and then you're done. That'll get you a D in this class. To get a higher than a D in the class, I'm going to need it to be centered on your opinion, which means every quote has got to be followed up by a discussion of the quote. Why did you quote it? Because you want to say something about it, right? You got to say your opinion and talk about it and discuss it. So you got to do that. Otherwise, there's no point. Like, and I'll tell you one thing that really makes me crack up when I read student papers. It happens all the time. Students will end their paper with a quote. They'll be like, in conclusion, Plato says blah, 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 blah. Plato should not be concluding your paper, because Plato's name is not at the top of your paper. Your name is at the top of your paper. So you can please quote Plato, quote him a lot, but don't conclude with Plato's words. Conclude with your opinion of Plato's words. And every time you quote, you've got to have your personal opinion in there. Okay, cool. I think we basically did it for quotation, paraphrase, and summary, but we'll look at some examples in the next video.